As a genre, cyberpunk explores a variety of challenging ideas. It sometimes calls into question the nature of humanity and the human body, prompting us to rethink established consensus about the nature of the body itself. Sometimes it'll zone in on the prospect of AI and robotic consciousness, implying that machines may be here for reasons other than to simply serve us. And what about the political nature of a cyberpunk world? Is the massive reduction in privacy and freedom worth the trade for the benefits gained from advanced, more inclusive technology? There are a lot of deep philosophical subjects to explore here, and games like Deus Ex or Observer have taken thoughtful approaches to tackling them. Ruiner, however, is more... Ruiner is a cyberpunk shooter made by Polish company Raycon Games, not to be confused with upcoming cyberpunk shooter Cyberpunk 2077 made by Polish company CD Projekt Red. 2007, you know what I mean. This may sound like a petty comparison, but interestingly enough, many of Ruiner's developers first worked on CDPR's Witcher games before breaking away to form their own studio. It's not exactly an Ant's Bug Life scenario, as there will be about a 3-year gap between both games' releases, but I found it quite interesting to note nonetheless. When writing this, I thought about suggesting an interesting little narrative that Raycon had broken away from CDPR unamicably and tried to create their own cyberpunk game out of pure spite, in a Dave Mustaine-esque attempt to one-up their former employers. But judging by these Twitter posts, it seems like there's no bad blood between the two studios, which is nice, but bad news for anyone that likes a little bit of drama. I guess I also don't have to deal with a libel lawsuit, so good news for me too. The game starts with you, a guy in a pretty cool mask, breaking into the headquarters of Super Corporation Heaven under the control of a hacker who has little else to say other than kill boss. As you follow his instructions and delve closer to your target, you're rescued by her, an exceptionally skilled hacker who diverts you from your murderous path. She tells you that your brother has been kidnapped and aims your violent rampage at whoever was behind his capture. Dubbing you Puppy, and using the city of Renkok as a base, Her tracks down a series of higher-ups responsible for taking advantage of you, and so you head off to enact bloody retribution, leaving hordes of dead underlings in your wake. From here on out, there will be major spoilers for the game's story, and of course lots of gore, in case you hadn't guessed that from the intro. So that's your warning. Hope you like it. One of the most fun aspects of viewing a piece of cyberpunk media is checking out all the cool concepts the creators came up with. It's a genre where sometimes even just reading the wiki for something can be fun, and sure enough, Ruiner doesn't disappoint. I won't go into everything here, but I particularly liked the imagination farms, these giant facilities holding vats in which the sensory experiences in people's minds are quite literally harvested. These experiences are used to fuel Virtuality, a VR system produced and marketed by the game's main antagonists. Those consuming Virtuality are able to experience new forms of reality, at the expense of those who volunteer their literal life's energy and who are unceremoniously disposed of once they have nothing left. The people that volunteer themselves to Virtuality tend to be poor and out of hope, with this fate being the only alternative to outright destitution. While they are harvested, those rich enough to afford Virtuality profit from their misery and eventual brain death. A particularly cynical person might say that there are comparisons to be made with certain real-life systems and organizations. What big companies can we think of that ruthlessly exploit the poor and desperate while making ludicrous amounts of cash off them? Nothing really comes to mind. It's not a particularly complex reading or comparison, but it's still a little more depth than Ruiner at first seems to offer, so the game isn't all just dumb balls-to-the-wall violence. However, no matter how interesting the backdrop of Virtuality might be, the game itself frustratingly only uses it as a backdrop. I feel like this concept was such an interesting idea and merited further exploration. Maybe your character has to go inside Virtuality to retrieve some data, in a kind of a trippy dream sequence or something. Maybe you'd free characters from inside the machines and ally with them, I don't know. But no, there's no real room for that, because Ruiner is designed as a fast-paced, twin-stick run-and-gun shooter where you only explore these areas and themes in the small amount of downtime you have between smashing someone's face in with a pipe. The world has a lot of interesting themes and ideas surrounding it, but we only have a bit of time to look at them before we're pulled back into the game's more linear main story. You rampage through the virtuality factory because it's in your way, and very little more. So in the end, this entire backdrop feels like it's in the game because it seems like a cyberpunk thing to include. It feels cool, it feels appropriate, and so it works to further embellish the cyberpunk world at a purely surface level. It's not the only part of Ruiner's story and world that I found quite lacking. Because the genre deals so heavily with issues of memory and consciousness, a cyberpunk story is perfect for exploring perceptions of reality itself, and not just the character's perception of the reality they live in, but the player's perception too. The twist that everything you've known to be true is actually a manufactured illusion is quite a common one, and it's present in many genres besides cyberpunk. We all remember the "would you kindly" scene from Bioshock, or the AI kernel's meltdown in MGS2, right? They tear the player and character out of their formerly comfortable, established reality and into a new unknown, forcing us to question our experience. If that past half of the game was a fake or manipulated reality, how can we be sure that our current state is real too? This twist isn't only used in games, but it's especially effective on this platform because you get invested in a character's development in a way that isn't as comparable with any other medium. When you play a character, you are involved in how that character grows and progresses, so if they're betrayed, it feels like you're personally being betrayed too. In Ruiner, towards the end of the game, you come to realize that the brother you've been searching for in fact doesn't exist at all. Puppy is nothing more than a clone of the boss, his body parts used as spares in case the boss needs anything replaced. The boss used her, who is actually a super advanced AI program, to manufacture all memories and connections to this brother. By planting them in Puppy's mind and painting the game's antagonists as the ones responsible for his brother's capture, the boss was able to orchestrate the downfall of those opposing him and retrieve his walking organ bank at the same time. So all along, you've been misled into thinking your bloodthirsty quest was all in aid of rescuing your brother, but in reality all you've done is take out the boss's enemies for him. In the end, though Puppy has ostensibly been acting of his own free will, his quest to rescue his brother is just as controlled as his initial mission to kill the boss. The problem with Ruiner's usage of this trope is that, with the exception of her, the characters involved just aren't developed enough to make the eventual reveal impactful. Puppy is the epitome of a silent protagonist, with your dialogue choices not really changing much of how the story develops. We don't learn anything about the boss until the end, save for the detail that he's the boss of a mega corporation. Your brother, the central focus of the game, is seen as nothing more than a body in a tube. You don't even get any flashbacks or history between him and Puppy. If Puppy's connection to his brother was so important that he'd kill hundreds of people for him, why haven't we seen any evidence of it? It's almost a spoiler because as soon as I heard about this mysterious brother without any further details, without him being mentioned before, I immediately thought something was up. Her is supposed to be this super powerful AI. Couldn't she manifest some fake memories too? So I didn't feel involved enough in the story to feel personally betrayed. However, I did feel like there was other potential for the game to affect the player directly and flesh out what is a fairly simple twist ending. Now, this might also be a bit of a contentious one, so please keep hearing me out on these. In a few subtle ways, the game is also manipulating the player to follow its will. Take the first mission, where Puppy is hacked. This stage has Wizard, the person hacking him, ordering you to kill boss, using terms familiar to anyone who's played games before. It uses negative reinforcement to encourage the player to follow its rules. Whether you like it or not, distrust Wizard or not, you have to kill boss to continue. This is a more blatant, malevolent form of manipulation, but the rest of the game only differs from this in a subtle way. In the main game, you still have to fight through gory battles and kill bosses, but here you are encouraged for succeeding, rather than being penalised if you don't. End of area splash screens rate you on how much carnage you caused, encouraging you to kill brutally and quickly to gain a coveted S+ ranking. All the time you're being cheered on and encouraged by her, a cute and quirky gamer girl GF who frequently drops emojis into her dialogue. I mean, look at her. You want to win for her, don't you? You want that adorable, bouncy portrait pic when you slaughter people quickly enough, right? You can trust her, she's a gamer just like you, she's a cute sidekick. She is your wife. So even though the player doesn't really have any investment in saving this fictional character's brother, they do have an investment in having fun, beating bosses and racking up high scores. The player is more than willing to go along with what her tells them to do, even though they might not trust her, and in the end, they help her and the boss get what they want regardless. Though you're not being hacked or forced as a player, you are still being manipulated by the AI into serving their goals. But this is only my reading of what's going on in the game. There's nothing in the game that really suggests you're meant to interpret Ruiner this way, which is a shame, I think, because there was potential to play around with the player's perception of what's going on. Kill boss is a clear command issued to both the player character and the player, and I really wanted to see some more of that throughout the game. In a game where the player character's consciousness is being controlled, why not imply that the player's consciousness is being controlled as well? I know it sounds like I'm getting annoyed that the game didn't pander to my interpretation, but I think there was real potential to develop more considering how the game misleads its main character, and they could have gone even further with the theme. I mean, it's cyberpunk, right? You're literally playing the game through a cybernetic interface with a godlike AI controlling what you see. Is it a stretch to say that this could maybe have been expanded on? To me, this is another example of Raycon using the cyberpunk aesthetic, but only on that purely surface level. They didn't push the themes or their ideas to their full potential, choosing instead to tell a simple story that just serves to move the main character from bloody fight to bloody fight. There's so much more to the lore in the game that isn't explored in a satisfying way because of how limited Raycon's vision seemed to be, and I'm not using the term limited to describe a lack of imagination or effort in the game's story, because it's clear there's a creative vision there. Raycon just apparently didn't really plan on exploring themes like this in a game that's meant to be a pretty simple shooter. True enough, that approach is probably best served for RPGs and more thoughtful experiences, but I can't help thinking that there's a lot of missed potential in introducing such interesting themes and then doing very little with them. It made me wonder if cyberpunk was really the best genre to use for this kind of game. While the aesthetic looks great and the cybernetically enhanced violence can be fun and visually stimulating, though hopefully not too stimulating, that's a watered down version of what cyberpunk as a genre offers. As I said in the intro, it's more than just getting cool cybernetic upgrades and blasting people apart, and I feel like Raycon didn't take full advantage of the genre they'd chosen. If you've watched my video on Blasphemous, I made a similar argument there. The world building was fascinating, but I couldn't enjoy it as much as I'd liked because of how that game was structured. I'm not expecting games to pander to my particular expectations, but it just feels like a shame when these promising indie titles with great ideas and concepts end up focusing their attention away from what makes them so interesting. So, I wasn't completely satisfied with the game's story and depiction of cyberpunk ideas. There was a lot of potential here that I don't think was developed enough, used only as a background to the gameplay. In that case, the gameplay must be really good, right? Ruiner is, as you've probably figured out by now, a top-down twin-stick shooter. Puppy starts out with his trademark pipe and a basic handgun, picking up more powerful weapons as you work your way through. The weapon system works very similarly to games like Metal Slug or Hotline Miami. Weapons have limited uses, and once your ammo or durability's gone, you'll need to find another. This means you're constantly grabbing whatever you can get your hands on, constantly switching between different types of guns in a mad scramble to survive. There's also an upgrade system, which players work through using experience, or karma, gained from killing enemies, opening chests, or completing side quests. The upgrades are split between passive abilities, such as extra health or ammo for your weapons, and usable abilities, allowing you to do things like enhance your dashing or project an energy shield to hide behind. The missions themselves mainly consist of arena brawls with lots of enemies, broken up with mini-boss fights, actual boss fights, and walking through the corridors between them. Not that the corridors are complete walking sims, there are obstacles to avoid and little hacking minigames along the way. Outside of each mission, you have access to a central hub where you can talk to NPCs to gain little bits of background lore about the game, as well as take on small side missions to get more karma. These are small diversions though, and the majority of what you'll be doing in Ruiner is well, you know. So, with the game's story and characters being underwhelming, a lot is riding on the gameplay here, specifically on the action. So, how is it? Well, it's functional enough. Clearing out a challenging wave of enemies feels good, as well as Ruiner killing a boss that's been giving you a hard time. As in literally every game ever, it's also fun to blow up a ton of red coloured barrels and wipe out huge amounts of enemies with explosions. The hacking minigame is simple, you just press the right arrows in the right order, but it feels good to tap 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 until the barrier goes down. It also feels really nice to open treasure chests. Seriously, I haven't had this much fun opening a chest full of goodies since God of War. And if it sounds like I'm rushing a bit through the positives, yeah, I guess I am. Let's start with the weapon selection. It's not exactly the most innovative. You have several indistinguishable types of machine gun, pistols, shotguns, a flamethrower and a minigun, so nothing much out of the ordinary there. However, you do also have some cool energy weapons, several blunt objects, and the obligatory cyberpunk katana, so there is a little bit of variety. I can't help but think they could have been more creative with their design, but that's more a problem I have with most modern shooters, so it's not really specific to Ruiner. The abilities, however, felt pretty flat for me, being mostly retreads of abilities in other games or passive effects that don't really make me feel like I'm doing anything directly. How many times have you seen that make enemies fight for you ability flying around in games? It's fun in something like Assassin's Creed where your approach is more strategic, but in a fast-paced shooter it feels like you're outsourcing the fun. The only ability I really enjoyed using was the kinetic barrier, which adds an element of zone denial and gives you a way to play the game more defensively, so you can customize your playstyle a little bit. But I only chose this ability because none of the others really seemed interesting. Why have abilities like Grid Converter and Supply Drop, which only give slight enhancements to the gameplay, when you could have added some other crazy effects in there instead? Once again, it feels like this is Raycon being too conservative in their vision, where they could have used the game's genre and setting to really break out of the mold. However, cliched weapons and unimaginative abilities would have been fine if the game itself felt satisfying. Doom Eternal, one of my favourite games of this year, mostly used weapons you've seen before, and yet the base mechanics and overall feel of the game means that doesn't really matter. The game feels crunchy, brutal, and overall really good to play. Ruiner's combat, sadly, doesn't feel as satisfying as a game like this needs to be. When your game places so much focus on bloody brawls, you should make sure that those fights feel as impactful as possible. Devil May Cry absolutely nails this feeling, with sound and graphic effects perfectly telegraphing each blow. Vulnerable enemies recoil after each hit, and even blows on armoured enemies give you a nice sense of feedback. The aforementioned Hotline Miami also effectively relays the impact of every brutal blow, a good thing considering the visceral nature of violence is a key theme in that game. This was always something I thought the earlier God of War games didn't quite get right. While the QTE sections are appropriately brutal, your average combat segment tended to feel like you were just beating up on blood-filled sandbags, your hits barely seeming like they registered sometimes. And this is how Ruiner feels too. While the sound effects on the guns are perfect for the most part, the visual feedback when you hit an enemy just isn't there. The enemy flashes red, and if you squint against the game's dark backgrounds you can sometimes make out a bit of blood, but the overall effect is very subtle. You just sort of flail or pump ammo into an enemy until they ragdoll away to their death, or if their health gets low enough for you to Ruiner kill them. Sure, the flamethrower and energy weapons look pretty good when you're firing them, but if it feels like you're shooting enemies made of paper, well, that's not very effective. The Ruiner kills themselves, however, actually look pretty cool. They're gory, ridiculous, and even come with a cool slowdown just before you kill the enemy. At least the mechanic named after the game looks good, and it would be disingenuous if I didn't point this out. This iffy visual feedback translates to enemy attacks on the player too. With very subtle visual effects, it's hard to tell if you're getting damaged or not. As I reached the harder levels, I found myself constantly looking up at my health, not to check how much was left, but to check if any had depleted at all. There were times when I thought I was doing great but was actually getting pummeled, and times when I thought I was dead for sure, only to find that I still had most of my health left. This problem could probably be solved by moving the health and energy bars to a different point of the screen, maybe above Puppy's head, or by giving each bar a different colour to the overall red motif of the rest of the game. It's just another area where I'm not getting the feedback I need to actually play. The level design itself is also lacking and barely deviates from corridor, arena for most of the game. As I said earlier, the corridors aren't just walking sims, but they're not particularly engaging either, and a lot of the obstacles amount to just walking past them at the right time or spamming dash to blast through. There's a cool section where you ride the Superloop transit system between destinations, but what might have been a cool racing or obstacle course is reduced to simply holding a button while you build up speed. The arenas are similarly plain, being mostly little more than flat fights against hordes of enemies, occasionally punctuated by a mini-boss or a boss fight. Only very occasionally does Ruina shake things up. The first level applies a timer that kills the player when it runs out, forcing players to kill enemies in order to extend their life. This is a concept I thought they'd develop on throughout the game. As I said in the discussion about themes, this is a cyberpunk game where your brain and consciousness are wide open to exploitation. Maybe there are multiple different challenges and variations on this idea? Well, no, there aren't, and then they reuse this idea for the final fight in the game. The boss fights, while mostly being straight up shootouts against bigger, sandbaggy enemies, do sometimes deviate from the standard formula. While I didn't find it that fun, Traffic King's encounter involves you trying to destroy his shield by charging up 4 surrounding power generators and trapping him in the middle. It's a bit different, right? I also enjoyed the fights against the Angels, whose external body you need to destroy before hunting down and crushing all of the control cores that fly out of them. It's just unfortunate that this fight is repeated ad nauseum throughout the rest of the game. So I guess that just leaves the side missions, and there aren't very many of these, so there isn't really a lot left to say. The first involves you grabbing I Ching coins throughout the levels to receive a fortune, and the second involves you hacking spy cameras that look like cats. And that's about it. There is one other mission that you can pick up, but as you naturally complete it as you progress through the main story, I'm not counting it as a side mission. And yeah, that's it. I was expecting the central hub to refresh every time you return to it, meaning there'd be new people and new missions to explore, but apparently not. You just get a new I Ching and a new cat hacking mission every time. At least the cats are greater in number and in different places every time you return. It still doesn't make the experience any less repetitive though. There are other NPCs around, so I thought they'd have side quests attached to them too, maybe to flesh out their character or the world a bit more. And it's a real shame that they don't, because a lot of these characters have interesting little backstories or concepts attached to them. They remind me of the social links that you find in Persona games, where you're drip-fed little bits of information about their life and what they've got going on. But sadly, unlike those games, you never get any more than a little bit of knowledge about them, and it would have been great to see just a little bit more development there. I admit that, on the whole, I'm not really a fan of twin-stick style shooters, but I kept an open mind for Ruina, and I really wanted to be impressed by the game. Hopefully I've demonstrated here that I wasn't just unimpressed due to these prejudices, and also hopefully I've shown where the gameplay falls short, where it could have been something fun, because it really could have. Despite everything I've said, Ruina isn't a bad game. I was having a decent enough time that I managed to finish it, and I care about it enough to, well, make it the subject of this video, even though it was ultimately disappointing and I dreaded replaying it to get this footage. I said earlier that Raycon had only used the cyberpunk theme and aesthetic almost as window dressing. While I still stand by this criticism, I will say that they've used it very well. The general art direction of the game is stellar, with the character portraits having a really cool comic book quality to them. Each character's design stands out as something unique too, and they're just fun to look at. I feel like they'd fit really well in an RPG or other story-focused game like a Persona, like I say, or something like that. I feel like other people will be fine with just having a cyberpunk-themed twin-stick shooter, and that's okay. Maybe that's objectively enough, and this whole video can just be thrown in the trash. But sadly, it wasn't enough for me. And that's Ruina. While I wasn't a fan of the game, I am interested in what Raycon end up doing next. They've clearly got a great art design team, and it'd be nice to see them make a game that plays as good as it looks. Checking their website, they're currently working on an FPP game. What's an FPP? Is that first person? So they're gonna cut you in two? Man, split screen multiplayer is really coming back in style then. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next one.